September 23, 1952. A television studio in Los Angeles. Richard Nixon is making the speech that saves his career. He has brought his wife. She sits in an armchair just outside camera range. Her name is Pat Nixon. He will name her coat. He will not ask her opinion. The country will call her Plastic Pat. Stiff, controlled, unknowable. What the country will never know is that she privately believed everything her husband publicly opposed. This is the story of what it costs to stand perfectly still. It is good to have you with us tonight. There is a particular kind of woman, and American history is full of her, who has made herself invisible in order to make someone else visible, who has stood in rooms full of power and said nothing, who has smiled when required, traveled the world, kept no diary of what she truly saw, and worn, through the best years of her life, a face that was not entirely her own. We tend to remember the men at the center of such rooms, the speeches they gave, the enemies they made, the rises and the falls. What we tend to forget, what history has often chosen not to record, is the person standing 3 feet to the left. On September 23, 1952, more than 58 million Americans turned on their televisions to watch a young senator from California defend himself against allegations of financial impropriety. His name was Richard Nixon. He was being considered for the vice presidency of the United States. And on that night, to save his political career, he did something unusual. He brought his wife to the broadcast studio. He placed her in an armchair, just slightly out of frame, and he began to speak. He spoke about their mortgage, their car, her coat. She sat perfectly still. Her name was Pat Nixon. And in the years that followed that night, through the vice presidency, through a defeat, through a comeback, through a presidency, through a scandal that shook a nation to its foundations, she would sit perfectly still many more times. She would travel more countries than almost any first lady before her. She would be voted the most admired woman in the world. She would smile at the right moments, stand at the right distances, and say, when pressed, that she did not have time to be depressed. What she thought, what she truly believed, what she privately supported, what she privately endured, the world would not know for a very long time. Some of it we are only beginning to understand now. Tonight, we tell the story of Pat Nixon. Not the story of the Watergate scandal, though Watergate will come, as it came for all of them. Not the story of Richard Nixon's presidency or his fall, but the story of the woman who stood beside all of it. The woman the press called Plastic Pat, who was, as it turns out, nothing of the kind. Her story begins not in Washington, not in the White House, not in any room with cameras and crowds. It begins on the 16th of March, 1912, in a small mining town in the high desert of Nevada, where a father came home before dawn from the mines and named his daughter after the saint whose day was almost upon them. Her father's name was William Ryan. He worked the copper mines outside Ely, Nevada in the years before the First World War, when the town was still young enough to believe the mountains had something left to give. He was not a man given to sentiment, but when he came home before dawn on March 16, 1912, and learned that his wife had delivered a girl, he called her his St. Patrick's babe in the morn. He gave her the name Thelma, but it was the saint's name that stuck. She would always be Pat. The family did not stay in Nevada. Before she was a year old, her father moved them to a small truck farm in Artesia, California, on the flat edge of Los Angeles County, where the soil was alkaline and the work was constant and the sky was enormous and indifferent. It was not a romantic life. There were vegetables to grow, accounts that never balanced, and the particular grinding dignity of people who do not complain because complaining uses energy they cannot spare. Her two older brothers, William and Thomas, worked alongside their father, and Pat, the youngest, grew up in the way that youngest children sometimes do, watching everything, saying little, learning how to be useful before she had learned to be anything else. Her mother died in 1925. Pat was 13. There is no record of what she said about it. What is recorded is what she did. She took over the household. She cooked, she cleaned, she got herself to school. She kept going in the particular wordless way of someone who has understood, at 13, that the alternative to going is not surviving. Her father died 5 years later, in 1930. Pat was 18. She was, at that point, entirely alone. No parents, no inheritance worth speaking of. Two brothers with their own lives to begin. The Depression had just hollowed out the country, and Pat Ryan made a decision, quiet, private, unannounced to anyone, that she was going to keep going anyway. She would say much later in her life, "I have made my own decisions ever since my father died." She said it simply, without drama, the way you might note that you have always preferred mornings. It was just a fact about her. She had decided. She kept deciding. What followed were the years that official biographies tend to compress because they do not fit neatly into the image of the dignified woman who would later stand beside a president. She moved to New York City. She enrolled in a radiology course at Columbia University. She worked in a hospital, first as a secretary, then as an X-ray technician, living on what little that paid, in a city still bleeding from the worst the Depression had to offer. By all accounts of those who knew her then, she was not miserable about it. She was practical. She made friends easily. She had a quality, one that would stay with her through every decade of her life, of making whoever she was speaking to feel genuinely seen. After 2 years in New York, she came back to California. She enrolled at the University of Southern California, working part-time jobs on campus to pay her tuition. She reportedly took work as a film extra in Hollywood during those years, one of thousands of young women who crossed in and out of studio lots for the few dollars a day it offered. Whether she found any part of it interesting, the record does not say. What it suggests is only that she was not the kind of person to find anything beneath her. She needed money. She worked. She kept her grades. She graduated from USC in 1937 with a degree in education and merchandising. 25 years old, no family to attend the ceremony. She moved to Whittier, California to teach typing and shorthand at the local high school. It was a quiet life, structured, self-sufficient, built from scratch by her own hands. She was a good teacher, popular with students, organized, demanding in the specific way of someone who has never been handed anything and does not believe anyone else should expect to be. She had friends. She had a small social life. She went to the movies. She took long drives. She had made herself into something real from materials that were, by any measure, insufficient. And she seemed, by the accounts of those who knew her in those Whittier years, genuinely at ease with what she had built. In the autumn of 1938, a friend persuaded her to audition for a part in a local amateur theater production. The group was called the Whittier Community Players, and they rehearsed in a church hall. She went. She got a part. And at one of the first rehearsals, a young lawyer who had also just joined the group crossed the room, sat down beside her, and introduced himself. His name was Richard Nixon. He was 24. He had just returned from Duke Law School and set up a small practice in town. He was not, by most accounts, a man who made comfortable first impressions, too stiff in social situations, more at ease with arguments than with people. The kind of person who seemed to be calculating something even when he smiled. He told Pat Ryan, within hours of meeting her, that he intended to marry her. She thought he was ridiculous. She said so, or close enough to it. She was not looking for a husband. She had a job, a routine, a life she had assembled herself from very little, and no particular interest in a nervous young lawyer who announced his intentions like a verdict. But he kept coming. For the next 2 years, Richard Nixon drove Pat Ryan to dates with other men and waited in the car until they were over. He wrote her letters. He showed up when he had not been invited. He applied himself to the problem of her refusal with the same focused, relentless energy he applied to everything else, as though it had not occurred to him that the answer might simply be no. Whether this was love or determination, or the two things tangled into something neither of them could separate, the historical record does not settle. What it settles is only the outcome. On June 21, 1940, in a small ceremony in Riverside, California, Pat Ryan married Richard Nixon. She had survived childhood poverty, the Depression, 2 coasts, the particular loneliness of building a life from nothing. She had never needed rescuing. She had never needed anyone. She had simply never met anyone who would not stop asking. She had not asked for a political life. That is worth noting at the outset, because it is easy, looking back at the decades that followed, to assume she must have wanted it. She did not. What she had wanted and built and been content with was a quiet, self-made existence in a California suburb. A job she was good at, friends she had chosen herself, a life that asked nothing of her but competence and showing up. What she got instead was Richard Nixon's ambitions, and she carried them without complaint for 34 years. In 1946, Nixon ran for Congress. Pat addressed envelopes. She answered phones. She stood on stages in town halls and smiled at strangers who had come to look at the candidate's wife. And she said what was required of her, and she drove home and made dinner. She was not paid. Nixon would note this himself years later as a virtue, proof of his family's modesty, that Pat Nixon had never, in all her years of working for his campaigns, drawn a government salary. He said it as a compliment. She received it as a fact of her life. In 1950, he ran for Senate. She campaigned again. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower chose him as his running mate for the presidential ticket, and almost immediately, the whole thing began to unravel. A newspaper report accused Nixon of maintaining a secret political fund supplied by California businessmen. The allegation was not subtle. It suggested he had been bought. Eisenhower's advisors began to press for Nixon's removal from the ticket. Republican leaders across the country made clear they would not publicly defend him. The calls for Nixon to resign from the race multiplied by the hour. Nixon decided to go on television. This was not the obvious move. Television in 1952 was still new enough that most politicians treated it like a trap, a medium that flattened nuance and amplified anything awkward, anything unrehearsed, anything too human. What Nixon proposed was to stand inside that trap voluntarily and invite 60 million Americans to judge whether he deserved to stay. He would make it personal. He would read out his finances, line by line, mortgage by mortgage. He would be humble. He would be, in the carefully managed way of a man who understood performance, a little bit raw. And he would bring Pat. On the afternoon of September 23, 1952, the two of them arrived at a CBS broadcast studio in Los Angeles. Nixon was visibly shaken. In the studio, according to accounts from those present that day, he turned to Pat and said quietly, "I just don't think I can go through with this one." She took his hand. She said, "Of course you can." And she walked him to the stage. He sat at a desk. She sat in an armchair to his right, slightly out of frame, visible when the camera chose to find her, and invisible when it did not. She folded her hands in her lap. For 30 minutes, Nixon spoke directly to the American people. He described his modest beginnings. He listed everything he owned and everything he owed. He talked about his dog. And then, at one particular moment, he mentioned his wife. He said, "I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat, and I always tell her that she'd look good in anything." The camera turned to her. She was smiling. Contemporary accounts describe her expression in that moment as something careful, composed in the way that people are composed when composure is the only option available to them. One reporter described her as looking stricken beneath the smile. Another said simply that she was there, visible and still, the way a well-placed piece of furniture is visible and still. She had been summoned to this room to serve a purpose. She was serving it. The speech worked. Tens of thousands of telegrams flooded the Republican National Committee within hours. Public sentiment swung hard in Nixon's favor. Eisenhower kept him on the ticket. The fund story was buried. The crisis passed. And what happened to Pat Nixon in that moment? What it meant to sit in a national broadcast and hear your coat named as evidence of your husband's virtue? The historical record does not say. She did not say. She was not asked. What she did in the days and weeks after the Checkers broadcast was continue. She kept campaigning. She kept standing on stages. She kept addressing the envelopes and driving the routes and smiling at the right moments. She had walked him to the studio when he could not walk himself, and she had sat in the armchair when the cameras were rolling. And the speech had worked. And that was the end of that chapter. Or so it seemed. What was harder to see from the outside was that September 23, 1952, was not the end of anything. It was closer to a rehearsal. In the 22 years that followed, Pat Nixon would sit in many more rooms, beside many more cameras, and wear many more smiles that were not entirely her own. She would become, in the public imagination, the perfect political wife. Still, composed, controlled, the woman who never cracked. What no one knew, what almost no one thought to ask, was what she actually believed. What she believed, it turned out, was quite a lot. By January of 1969, when Richard Nixon was inaugurated as the 37th President of the United States, Pat Nixon had spent nearly 3 decades standing at the edges of rooms where decisions were made, and keeping whatever she thought about those decisions to herself. She had learned, with considerable practice, how to be present without being recorded, how to be visible without being seen. The White House years would change something about that. Not loudly, not in the way the press would notice or the way that would be captured in the headlines of the day, but in the quiet, daily work of being First Lady. Work that Pat Nixon took more seriously than almost anyone in that building understood. The real woman began to surface. She told an interviewer once, when asked what her signature cause would be as First Lady, that she did not have one. Not in the way her predecessors had. Not a single issue, a single campaign, a branded initiative. What she had instead was something simpler and, in its way, harder to categorize. "People are my project," she said. It was not a political answer. It was not designed to play well in a headline. It was just the truth of how she operated, in the particular one-at-a-time way of someone who has grown up without a safety net and knows, from the inside, what it means when a stranger shows up and treats you like you matter. She traveled, more than almost any First Lady before her. 83 countries over the course of her time in the White House, active war zones in Vietnam, earthquake rubble in Peru, the capitals of 30 African nations as the First Lady ever to travel to that continent. These were not state visits with motorcades and gala dinners, though those happened too. What Pat Nixon sought in every country she entered was the hospitals, the schools, the orphanages, the village markets, the rooms where ordinary people lived and where, according to everyone who traveled with her, her presence had an effect that was difficult to explain and impossible to manufacture. A Peruvian general, watching her move through the ruins of an earthquake zone in 1970, was quoted afterward as saying that her visit had done more for relations between their country and the United States than anything America had done in 100 years. She was not performing that. She was doing it. There was, in those years, another Pat Nixon that existed entirely outside the public record, visible only to the small number of people close enough to the White House to see it. This was the Pat Nixon who privately told aides and confidants that she supported the Equal Rights Amendment, who told people she knew that she believed women had the right to make their own decisions about abortion, before the Supreme Court had weighed in on the matter, before it was settled, before it was safe to say so as the wife of a Republican president, who told anyone who would listen that she thought a woman should be named to the Supreme Court. According to Heath Hardage Lee, drawing on research conducted at the Nixon Presidential Library, Pat Nixon raised the question of a female Supreme Court justice repeatedly with White House staff. The effort was made. A candidate was identified. The nomination did not go forward. She said nothing about it publicly. She also said nothing publicly about a visit she arranged sometime around 1971 that has since become one of the quieter, remarkable stories of those years. Jacqueline Kennedy, whose husband had been assassinated in 1963, whose official portraits still hung in the White House, had not been back to the residence since the day she left it after the funeral. She had not seen what had become of that space. She had not seen how her own image had been placed, officially, in the halls she had once walked. According to biographer Heath Hardage Lee, Pat Nixon called her. She arranged for Jackie Kennedy and her children to visit the White House privately. No press, no announcement, no cameras, no ceremony of any kind. Just a former First Lady coming home to a house that had been hers, with the courtesy and discretion of the woman who now lived there. This was not a political act. It was a human one. It was Pat Nixon doing what Pat Nixon actually did, stripped of the image and the management and the careful stillness that the cameras had taught her to perform. The woman the press called Plastic Pat, stiff, unknowable, the political wife as decorative object, had, in private, been traveling to war zones and arranging acts of grace for grieving women, and quietly pushing for rights she was not allowed to publicly claim. She had, as she once put it simply and without ceremony, been making her own decisions. The year 1972 would mark the peak of everything. She was voted the most admired woman in the world, not just in America, but in the world. Nixon was re-elected in a landslide. The White House, from the outside, had never looked more secure. What none of those admirers could see, what Pat Nixon herself may not have fully understood yet, was that somewhere inside the walls of that building, something had already gone wrong. On the morning of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate office complex in Washington. They had been there to bug the phones. Their connection to the Nixon re-election campaign would take months to surface fully. By that point, the cover-up had already begun. Pat Nixon read about it in the newspapers. This is the detail that matters most, and that is also the one most easily overlooked in the larger machinery of the Watergate story. A story so crowded with tapes and subpoenas and Saturday night massacres that it leaves almost no room for the question of what it was like to be the one person in that building who was told nothing. The man who had driven her on dates with other men to stay close to her. The man whose career she had built with her hands, her silence, her 30 years of standing in the correct positions and saying the correct things at the correct moments. That man had a secret recording system installed in the Oval Office, and Pat Nixon learned of its existence from the front page of a newspaper like everyone else. According to biographer Heath Hardage Lee, drawing on research at the Nixon Presidential Library, the men who had taken control of Nixon's inner circle in those years, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, his chief of staff and domestic affairs advisor, had made a deliberate effort to limit Pat's access to her husband during the Watergate period. They did not want her advising him. They did not want her voice in the room. The woman who had been Nixon's closest political confidant for 25 years was, in the crisis of his presidency, kept at a careful distance from the truth. She knew something was deeply wrong. She would have had to be someone else entirely not to know. What she did not know was the full weight of what was coming. She argued, when she understood the tapes existed, that they should be destroyed while they were still legally private property. Nixon did not listen. She watched the months unfold, the hearings, the revelations, the careful unraveling of everything they had built, from a position of almost complete helplessness. She could not defend him publicly with information she did not have. She could not advise him through walls that had been built around him by other people. She could only stand where she had always stood, 3 feet to the left, visible when the camera required it, invisible when it did not. As the summer of 1974 moved toward its end, and it became clear that there was no path forward, Nixon began to consider resignation. Pat Nixon opposed it. She told him, according to her daughter Julie's account, which remains the closest we have to Pat's own voice in those weeks, that he should stay, that he should fight, that resigning would be surrendering to people who had been wrong about him. Later, she would tell Julie, "Watergate is the only crisis that ever got me down, and I know I will never live to see the vindication. The thing that's so sad is that I don't think there is a man living who has more noble qualities, who is as kind and thoughtful and unselfish." She meant it. Whatever else is true of those years, she meant it. Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974. The following morning, more than 400 members of the White House staff gathered in the East Room to hear him say goodbye. Pat Nixon stood near the front, a few feet from her husband, in a yellow dress. Nixon spoke for nearly 30 minutes. He spoke of Theodore Roosevelt. He spoke of his mother. She was a saint. And of his father, and of the men who had worked beside him, and of the strange privilege of having served. His voice broke several times. The room was, by most accounts, barely holding together. He did not say his wife's name once. Henry Kissinger, who was present that morning, would write in his memoirs that he had not approved of the omission, that without Nixon's particular capacity for self-deception, Pat must have suffered the most grievously of all. The historian Stephen Ambrose, writing in his 3-volume biography of Nixon, called the oversight odd. He called it insensitive. He wrote that it made many of those watching wince. Pat Nixon did not wince, or if she did, no camera was close enough to record it. When the speech was over, the family walked down the red carpet of the South Lawn toward the waiting helicopter. Nixon paused at the top of the stairs and raised both arms in his signature V sign, the gesture he had been making since his first campaigns, the gesture that by that morning had become its own kind of American shorthand. He climbed aboard. Pat followed. The helicopter rose from the lawn and turned west. She did not cry. Not where anyone could see her. George H.W. Bush, who was present on the lawn that morning as chairman of the Republican National Committee, wrote in his diary that Nixon had looked just awful. He described the grief in the room, the tears on the faces of people who had worked for the president for years. He wrote about the strange texture of that morning, the grief and the history of it, the sense of an era closing. He did not write what Pat Nixon's face looked like. Nobody, it seems, was watching closely enough to record it. Or perhaps the truth is simpler than that. By August 9, 1974, the country had known Pat Nixon for 22 years. They had watched her sit in armchairs and stand on stages and smile in receiving lines and hold composure through every conceivable pressure. They already knew what her face looked like when everything was breaking around her. It looked exactly the same as when things were fine. The helicopter carried them to Andrews Air Force Base, and then a plane carried them to California, and then a motorcade carried them through the gates of La Casa Pacifica, the house on a bluff above the Pacific Ocean that they had called the Western White House, and that was now simply home. The Secret Service detail that had surrounded them for years was reduced. The phone calls stopped coming. The world, which had required so much of both of them for so long, moved on with remarkable speed. What came next was the part of the story that history tends to skip. What history tends to skip is the part that comes after the helicopter. The house at San Clemente sat on a bluff above the Pacific, surrounded by bougainvillea and cypress and the particular silence of a place that has been stripped of purpose. La Casa Pacifica, the peaceful house. It had been the Western White House, the place where Nixon had received foreign leaders and conducted the business of the presidency against a backdrop of California light and ocean air. Now it was just a house where two people lived with a reduced security detail and a telephone that rang considerably less than it used to. Nixon was not well. In October of 1974, barely 2 months after the resignation, he was admitted to the hospital with phlebitis, a blood clot in his leg that had been worsening for months, ignored or managed or simply pushed aside in the chaos of the final Watergate year. The surgery was serious. He went into shock from internal bleeding and required a second operation. For several days, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The man who had dominated American political life for nearly 3 decades came close to dying in a hospital in Long Beach, California, a few weeks after leaving the presidency in disgrace. Pat Nixon was at his bedside. She had been kept from the truth during the worst of Watergate. She had been managed and handled and isolated by the men who surrounded her husband in those years. She had stood on the South Lawn and not been named in his farewell speech. And now she sat in a hospital room and held the hand of the man who had done all of that. And she stayed. She stayed because that was who she was. Because 34 years of building something together does not simply stop when the building collapses. Because she had said in the East Room of the White House that she believed in him, and she had meant it in the complicated way that only someone who has known a person for that long can mean it. She stayed in the way that someone stays with a person they have long since stopped being able to understand fully, but cannot stop caring for. He recovered. They went back to San Clemente. The years began to pass. Nixon gradually began the long rehabilitation of his public image. Interviews, memoirs, the slow re-emergence of a man working to be taken seriously again. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. Comeback was the through line of his entire life, and even after the worst fall in American political history, the instinct remained. Pat Nixon did not rehabilitate anything. She had nothing to rehabilitate. She had survived Watergate with her reputation not merely intact, but, by most measures, improved. The public had never held her responsible for what her husband had done. But surviving with your reputation intact is different from knowing what to do next. She had no project. She had no office. She had no cause to speak to, no role to fill, no camera to perform for. The structure that had organized her adult life, the campaigns, the travel, the
The work of being First Lady was simply gone. She tended the garden. She read. She looked after her grandchildren when they came to visit. She was, by the accounts of those who saw her in those years, gracious and warm and completely unwilling to discuss any of it. In 1984, a decade after the resignation, Richard Nixon gave a series of interviews. He spoke about his presidency. He spoke about Watergate. And at one point, he was asked about his wife, about the nickname that had followed her for 30 years, the one the press had given her and that had stuck, the two words that had defined her in the public imagination longer than almost anything else. He said, "She was called Plastic Pat because she was my wife." Just that, matter-of-factly, as though it were obvious. The nickname had never been about her at all. It had been about him, about the suspicion and hostility that surrounded him, projected onto the woman who stood beside him because she was easier to reach. She had carried it for 3 decades. She had carried the press's contempt for her husband on her own face, in her own name, without ever being given a vocabulary to argue against it. And he named this, finally, in a television interview, with the same flat affect he brought to most revelations, as though it were simply a fact, worth noting, requiring no particular response. There was no record of what Pat Nixon said when she heard it. By that point, she had stopped saying much about any of it. On the afternoon of July 7, 1976, nearly 2 years after the helicopter, 18 months into the quiet of San Clemente, Pat Nixon was at La Casa Pacifica, a book open in her lap. The sun was on the water. The bougainvillea was in color. It was an ordinary afternoon. She felt something shift inside her skull. She set her book down on the table beside her chair. She stood up. She walked through the house and up the stairs. She lay down on the bed. She did not call her husband. She did not call her daughters. She had spent the better part of her adult life not making demands, not requiring assistance, not allowing whatever was happening on the inside to become visible on the outside. And so, when her body began to fail her in that quiet house in California on an ordinary July afternoon, she did what she had always done. She kept it to herself. Hours later, when it became impossible to conceal, an ambulance was called. The following day, July 8th, the New York Appellate Division formally disbarred Richard Nixon from the practice of law, the only time a court of law found him guilty of anything related to Watergate. Pat Nixon was in Long Beach Memorial Hospital when the ruling came down. Her neurologist, Dr. John Mosier, spoke to reporters at a news briefing the following morning. He said she had suffered a stroke of what he estimated to be 35 to 50% completeness. He said they did not yet know how permanent the damage would be. And then he added something that no one present seemed to treat as the most important thing he said that morning, though it may have been. He said, "Pressures in her life certainly could have been a contributing factor." She recovered, partially. She was 64 years old, and she had a stroke alone and walked upstairs and lay down and said nothing, and a doctor told the press that the pressures of her life had probably helped to cause it. The ambulance, when it came, was called by the Secret Service detail. She had been keeping silence for so long that even her body had learned not to ask for help. She recovered from the first stroke well enough to recover, in the limited way that word applies after the brain has been changed. She had a second stroke in 1983. She was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1992. She was 80 years old, and she had outlasted almost everything. The Depression, the campaigns, the White House, the exile, the silence of San Clemente, the years in New Jersey to which she and Nixon had eventually moved to be closer to their daughters and grandchildren. She had outlasted the nickname, the scandal,
and the particular American habit of discarding the people it has finished using. She did not complain. This is not a speculation. It is documented in the accounts of every person who knew her in those final years, the grandchildren, the daughters, the small circle of friends who had stayed close through everything. She was warm. She was interested in the people around her. She said, as she had said throughout her life when people asked how she was managing, that she did not have time to be depressed. Whether she believed it by then, or whether it had simply become the answer she had given for so long that it no longer felt like a choice, that is a question no one can answer. She had stopped giving interviews decades earlier. She had stopped being asked. Richard Nixon, in his final years, had returned to something like public relevance. He wrote books. He was consulted on foreign policy. Younger politicians sought his counsel. The rehabilitation he had been working toward since the helicopter left the South Lawn had proceeded, in its slow and contested way, further than most people in August of 1974 would have predicted. He was never forgiven, not entirely, not by everyone, but he was no longer simply a disgrace. He had made himself into something more complicated than that. Pat Nixon did not make herself into anything more complicated than what she had always been. She was, in those last years, a grandmother in New Jersey who had once been the most admired woman in the world and had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was neither surprising nor particularly important. On June 22, 1993, she died at home in Park Ridge, New Jersey. She was 81 years old. The news was reported respectfully and at some length, and the obituaries said the things that obituaries say: that she had served with dignity, that she had traveled more countries than any First Lady before her, that she had been a devoted wife and mother, that she had endured Watergate with composure. They did not say that she had been a feminist who supported abortion rights while serving as the face of a conservative administration. They did not say that she had been kept from the truth by the men who ran her husband's White House. They did not say that she had suffered a stroke alone and walked upstairs without telling anyone, because by 1993, the subtler facts of her life had not yet been assembled into anything the press knew how to report. Richard Nixon died 10 months later, in April of 1994. They are buried side by side at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California, a few feet from the small wood frame house where Nixon was born. A house that is modest in the way that houses from that era and that part of California tend to be modest. The kind of house where nothing is wasted and nothing is ornamental, and everything is there because it has a function. She had grown up in a house something like that. She had come from a mining town in Nevada with 2 brothers and a father who worked long shifts underground and a mother who died before she had finished needing her. She had built herself from nothing, traveled the world, sat in an armchair on national television while her husband named her coat, stood on the South Lawn on the worst morning of their lives and not flinched, walked upstairs alone when her body finally gave. She had, as she once said, made her own decisions ever since her father died. All of them. Every one. In her own way, in her own silence. That is the thing about Pat Nixon that the cameras never quite captured. Not in 1952, not in 1972, not on the South Lawn on August 9, 1974. The stillness was not emptiness. It was not plastic. It was not the absence of feeling or opinion or conviction. It was the presence of a woman who had decided, very early and very privately, how much of herself the world was entitled to see. She gave it exactly that much, not one thing more.